This is Green Watch, and I'm Hannah Melser, your host. Today we're going to be talking about police brutality, both locally in the city of Houston and nationally. With us today is Nikki Luellen, who's with Refuse Fascism and Texas Advocates for Justice, and Remington Alessi, a local organizer. Obviously, there's been a lot of talk in the media, especially the national media, about police brutality, whether it's been local incidents, national incidents of people being either hurt or shot, but also protests that have taken place nationally, whether it's on the large grandstand stage of the NFL or on the smaller local stage at local football games. So, Nikki, can you tell us about some of the activism you do?
Oh, well, some of the activism I do, I started off actually working for the Justice for Alva campaign, and that was when Alva Brazil was shot and killed. He was murdered on Cullinan Ward by two police officers, Edward Macias and Luis Lopez, with his hands in the air screaming, "Don't shoot." He was shot 16 times. So at the time, I was a student at Texas Southern University, and I was working for the TSU Herald. And there was a student that reached out to the TSU Herald, and then they said, well, I think you would like to cover this story. So I got with Miss Brazil, and I wrote an entire story on it. And at the time, after the story, I felt very helpless. I felt like there was nothing I can do. And she reached out to me again. She said, hey, Nikki, I like the story you did, and I would like you to do more. And so from that, I developed a relationship with Miss Nikita Brazil. And from that relationship, it came from me, actually getting involved with activism and fighting. So that's where I actually started. I worked for the Justice for Alva campaign. I also helped the families of Vincent Young. And I also fight personally myself against police brutality and other injustices that are occurring around this country. But my main fight is police brutality.
So you talked about Mr. Alvarez and Mr. Young. Can you tell us more about those kind of local stories?
Yes. Well, what happened with Alva Brazil, it was July 9th, 2016, and that was a national case. The problem is we had so many people that were outraged at the moment, and that outrage didn't last until, now you see there's less and less out. There's still this outrage, but it just seems to me that it's very concentrated on when there is a moment, then we react in a moment, and there's no real term solution. With the Justice for Alva campaign, and with him getting shot, we have to think about this too. What a lot of people didn't see was on the same day that Alva Brazil was murdered by the police officers, there was someone named Keith Swanson. He was a white male, in his middle-aged white male, and he had a shootout with the police the same day. That's a story that no one is showing. He was arrested without a scratch on his body. So when the police came and shot this black man down 16 times, we can see the same story with HPD that happened on the same day, where he had a shootout with the police and they didn't do anything. So just because he was out looking for his horse, and his wife got a call saying that, hey, your husband was brutally executed in the streets. And so when we look at Keith Swanson, he had a shootout. They negotiated, sent the SWAT team in, but when it comes to black people, it's not the same thing.
Did they take him to Burger King after?
Oh, well, they might have.
Like, I don't know. I'm not sure. Is that part of the red carpet service that they give to
yes.
white people?
Yes, I mean, we can look at the FBI. We can look at what they're doing and saying that black extremists now are the people that they're targeting and the danger to the community, when the real danger has always been this white terrorism that has occurred in this country with the Ku Klux Klan. And we've had parties actually supporting this, the Democratic Party, which people seem to forget now that Trump is in office, that it was the Democratic Party that supported the Ku Klux Klan. But I mean, white terrorism is rampant in America, and somehow they're not labeled as terrorists, but these terrorist attacks that we've seen came from this right-wing Trump supporters, and they're fascists. So.
Yes, I think it's obvious and clear that America does have a long history with racial violence and a government system that has at times, if not perpetrated, actively supported or turned a blind eye to it. And that's been a real problem moving past those historical, how can I put this, bad times. You know, if you want to move past that, you actually have to accept that things were bad then and that they need to change. And so, how do you think we can kind of deal with this?
I kind of feel like it's baked into the system, and here's why. Like, Nikki, you mentioned the FBI, and the FBI is an important thing in this whole process. See, the FBI was originally started, I believe, somewhere in the 1890s is when it was originally floated through the federal government, and it picked up in popularity with the rise of socialist and anarchist movements in the early 1900s and a lot of these labor movements, and so. It was almost explicitly set up for the sole purpose of political repression. And when you start looking at once J. Edgar Hoover took over, that was where it got even worse because, you know, frankly, Hoover had a very long history of just absolute racism. Like he wouldn't, to my knowledge, he refused to hire black FBI agents. And it doesn't stop there. It's, you know, the harassment that he did to black activists, you know, the death threats that he sent to Dr. King, the issues of the federal government even being involved in the murder of Dr. King, and so the thing is, there's a trend for that the FBI started, and what it was that back in the 30s, J. Edgar Hoover figured out that he needed to win popular support for the FBI, because back then they were called G-men, and that was a slur, and they weren't allowed to carry guns, and people generally understood that the government was probably not to be trusted. And so you've got a rollout of like James Cagney films from the 1930s, G-men being one of them, where it was set up by Hoover for the sole purpose of propaganda. And there's an evolution of this that, frankly, Michelle Alexander talks about it a little bit in the new Jim Crow, where it evolves into stuff like the Ephraim Zimbalist Jr. show in the FBI, and you know, now the modern version is these shows like CSI, the crime procedurals, that all have this continuing theme where the law enforcement is there because they genuinely care about people. And it's meant to create the illusion that I think a lot of people buy into, which is that the police are not an explicitly racist organization. And I would argue that they are. The origins of American law enforcement started in slave patrols. And frankly, they're there to enforce racist laws in a very racist way. I mean, there's a very, you know, I don't think it's a particularly controversial thing to suggest that, you know, if Nikki gets in trouble, if Nikki gets pulled over for a traffic stop, it could be a death sentence. Yep. If I get pulled over for a traffic stop, they probably might tell me to slow down. You know, that's it. You know, I've gotten verbal warnings for things that they should take you to jail for, and you know, the statute of limitations has passed. So,
Good.
But like frankly, having a turn signal out can be a death sentence. So, you know, I guess this history, when we talk about like changing these institutions, to me, it's very important to acknowledge from the outset that this is baked into the institutions. Mm-hmm. This is what these institutions' roles are. This is what the purpose that they were originally set out to fulfill, and they've been in denial about it ever since as a PR routine, but nothing has been done to change it. In fact, like if you start looking at how these institutions typically respond, they don't respond by acknowledging the problem or saying we're going to fix it. They usually tend to give you know, very shallow apologies that, oh, well, you know, we're sorry that you were upset. You know, the sort of responses that aren't even really apologies and don't really acknowledge that there's a problem, because their purpose is to just do the least possible amount without actually making any sort of meaningful change.
So what you're saying is basically these institutions are functioning as designed, and they are designed to create and perpetrate racial disparities within the community in terms of arrests, convictions, the whole criminal
Absolutely.
justice gambit.
Absolutely, without a doubt, without a doubt. And by the way, I trust you to correct me if I get any of this stuff wrong.
No, it's true. It's very true.
Can you tell me more about exactly what happened to Mr. Brazil? So you said his horse had gotten loose, and he was.
Yeah, he got a call that night that his horse had gotten loose. He said he was going to go look for his horse. He went to go find his horse. 2 officers rolled up on him looking for trouble, I believe, and they shot him 16 times, executed him in the streets like an animal.
Was this in the middle of the night or during?
This was in the middle of the night.
Okay.
I believe it was at 12 a.m. in the morning.
Wow. And you said that he had his hands up and was saying don't shoot, that he was trying to explain to them.
Yes, he had his hands up. He said don't shoot. Now, when I look at the video, what the video shows is him turning around. When he's turning around, the officers are shooting him down in the streets.
Okay, so there's an actual video of this incident.
Yes.
Is it the police dash cam video, or was there some kind of a third person there shooting the video?
Oh, well, what happened is the police didn't turn their cameras on until Alva Brazil was on the ground. The Gulf store on Cullen, they showed a video, and that video shows that Alva Brazil has his hands in the air, and it shows him getting shot down. So that's what that video shows. Now, what the police shows is after he was dead and what the officer said, and, you know, what happened, what occurred afterwards.
And this happens often. Like, for instance, I want to say it was back in 2012, there was a 15-year-old robbery suspect by the name of Chad Hawley, who got chased down by some police officers who I believe hit him with their car at one point, and he originally had fled, but he laid down on his stomach and put his hand, he interlocked his fingers behind his neck. You know, I don't know that there are any other ways that somebody can more explicitly indicate submission. But a gang of about 6 officers ran up, surrounded him, started stomping on him, kicking him, punching him, and of course the video was not there. It wasn't until a little while later that the owner of a local mini storage that was adjacent to where he was arrested was going through his security footage and happened to see this whole thing happen. It was, and had it not been for this one guy going through his security footage, nobody would have heard Chad Hawley's name. You know, Chad Hawley would never have gotten any sort of justice. You know, at least this way people were able to see and acknowledge precisely how police treat even the most unthreatening of black men.
So it seems like when there is video, it's normally video from a convenience store or some other civilian video that happens to just be rolling at the time. There doesn't seem to be a lot of body cameras that are used in these incidents. Or do you think having body cameras being worn and having rules and regulations that said you have to have these on while you're on duty would help solve some of this?
No. No, I mean, we can see with Philando Castile where he told the police officer that he did have a weapon in his car, he did have a gun in his car, that he still was shot down. So it does not matter. They can see us, the police could see us, the courts could see us, America could see black people brutally getting shot, executed, beat up, and there's still no justice. So it does not matter. And at this point, it's always been sad, but it's pretty sad. And
I have to say, you know, for a long time I had hoped that that level of visibility would change things, that America's collective conscience would be awakened by seeing the sheer brutality of these things. And it saddened me a great deal to come to terms with how right Nikki is about this. And it's that, you know, in addition to the fact that these body cams have a long history of totally unrelated incidents where they get covered up when the police officer's beating up or murdering somebody, you know, they're, again, unrelated incidents, and purely coincidental. When you look back at incidents like Eric Garner even, that somebody can be strangled to death on video and the whole world can watch essentially what amounts to a lynching, and no justice is served. The only person who went to jail for that was Ramsey Orta, who was the man who filmed it. And only because there was a long-running campaign by New York Police Department to specifically target, harass, arrest, and punish this man for doing the slightest thing to hold them accountable for murder. So, like, I find it upsetting because I wanted to see the best in people and think that people would genuinely see these injustices and do something about it. And I don't think that's the case. I don't think that filming this is going to change anything, and it's because racism and white supremacy are so thoroughly woven into the DNA of this country that it's impossible to remove.
So do you think we've kind of become numb to the videos? Because I can remember, my history lessons, talking about, the civil rights movement in the 1960s, and there was the firebombing of the church where those little girls died, and that there was kind of like a national awakening then. Do you think we've just seen, with the 24-hour news cycle, we were just so inundated with violent videos and scenes of just tragic massacres that kind of thing just doesn't have the effect that it would have had, 50 years ago?
I was reading an article, and that article said that there has been stories about black people. Black people were subhuman, and these stories were stereotypical images of black people throughout history that showed, that made not only white America, but that made other people, even from other countries, view black people in a certain way, that black people were subhuman, that we were laughing buffoons, and if we ever got into office, it would be a catastrophe with birth of a nation. And so they said that throughout America, the pain for black people, no one ever really seen us, as having pain. It became a laughing matter. So black pain to a lot of white people has been as if it really just does not exist. And so I feel like that's a larger part of the problem is how black people are portrayed also in the media, as being laughing buffoons, as being people who are comfortable, who are happy with being slaves, happy darkies, or whatever they want to say. And so that has played a large role in the numbing of white America's treatment of black people. They deserve it. They've been suffering, they deserve to suffer because they don't feel the same pain as we do, because even with Thomas Jefferson saying that black women are subhuman. He compared black women to monkeys and said, they'll be desired to orangutan. And so when we look at the racist history of America, we can see that people really don't sympathize with black pain, and so that sympathetic nature has been woven into the fabric of America. And, we're not depending on the media to tell us the right stories. We're going to create our own media, of course, but this has been a large part of the problem, is the media that has portrayed this and that has said that it is okay to kill black people. I mean, let's look at the 1920s when there was lynchings. You had white children that was looking at these lynchings and looking at, a black person being lynched and saying, well, hey, my parents are laughing and, about it. So what's the problem? So now when we're getting lynched in the streets by a police gun, that's a culture that's been woven into America. So that's why there's not this outrage. I think when it comes to black people, we are just tired. Every time I see a video now, it's just a sad reality. It's another sad reality. And I got to look at it and I say, wow. It's another black person that's been killed, that's been shot, and there is this outrage there. There is still an outrage there, but it's like, when will it end? And that's the question. I think that's why a lot of people have now, I think still people are fighting, but that's why there's so much people that are saying it just happens. These are things that just happen, because it's happening so much, and then there's no justification.
Do you think it's just a long history of dehumanizing people of color? So it's not just a thing about not acknowledging black pain. It's not acknowledging people of color as equal human beings to everybody else,
Yes.
as seeing them as non-people. Because if you view that other person who's different from you as not really another person, it's easier to distance yourself from them. Because if you can identify and relate to that person, their suffering kind of becomes your suffering, because we're all human beings and we would naturally empathize with other people. But if we pretend that people, because of the melanin content of their upper dermis, are unhuman to other people, then I feel, going to get this inability to empathize.
Well, and then we go back to the criminalization of these people, of black people when they're killed. Oh, he might have had drugs in his system, or he had a weapon, or, this was his background. So all of these things are pulled up to justify the murder. If I can say that this person is a criminal, then the police had a right to kill this person. So, a person's background, if that person was on drugs or not, that's always brought up. And larger, when a police pulls up and kills a person, they don't know if that person had drugs in their system or not. They're not aware of their criminal record. But why does the media feel the need to go back and to bring up their criminal record and their criminal run-ins with the police, and to say, oh, we did an autopsy report and they might have had this in their system, or they had, so this is a way to normalize what is happening. So black people being murdered by the police, being executed, that has been normalized in this country.
And it continues to be normalized. This whole current of effectively dehumanizing people by portraying them as less than is something that is pervasive today. I mean, even what was it? Not a week ago, Dove released this ad that essentially portrayed black skin as being dirty, and it essentially involves if you wear Dove, you can take off that black skin, and there's secretly a beautiful white woman below. And and by the way, this was not anomalous for Dove, but what I found particularly telling was not Dove's already existing pattern of behavior, but instead, when the news reported on it, the headline was Dove pulls racist ad, but it had the word racist in quotes, because we're so unwilling in the media to discuss the harms of racism that they had to cheapen it by putting it in quotes, specifically as though to kind of mock the idea that someone would take offense at being dehumanized in a nationwide ad campaign.
Do you think there is a kind of a national or local, a trend to deny that racism exists in American society? Because I feel like that's a debate a lot of people have around their dinner tables or at Thanksgiving, is whether racism exists or not. And there seems to be a large cohort of people, I know in my personal life, or out in my community, that just don't believe racism exists anymore. And how do you talk to someone about that?
Personally, I think that in a lot of instances you can't. When people are entrenched in a cycle of denial, there's not a way to really reach them. And it's in the bits that I've tried to learn in doing anti-racism work, in trying to unlearn the racism that I grew up with. I have found that an addiction and recovery model works really well, as far as how to understand the way people are racist. Because if you point out to someone that a thing is racist, what it essentially means is this is hurtful. Now, if I step on your toe and you say, hey, that hurts, odds are I'm probably going to say, hey, I'm really sorry. Are you okay? I'm going to give you some sort of empathy, whereas the response to being told that a thing is racist, usually people go into the sorts of levels of denial and rehearsed responses that that are ordinarily reserved for someone who has been told that they have an alcohol problem. So like instead of saying, "Oh, I'm sorry, I stepped on your toe," it's a response along the lines of, "Oh no, I'm not a toe stepper honor. I didn't mean to step on your toe. My intentions were really great. You know what? My parents marched in the anti-toe stepper honor movement in the '60s." I'm trying to make light of this, but it's an entrenched problem, and until white folks take the initiative and the responsibility for addressing their own racism, it's not going to be. I don't think that white people are going to make a whole lot of progress any more than like an outreach will get an addict to change their behavior. They have to want to change that behavior.
Yeah, I mean, I just second what Remington said. That's very true. Like I said before, the culture of America is racist, and then if you admit that there's a problem, then you have to do something about it. And so by white denial, it's saying, there's not a real problem. They want to, and let's be clear, just because we topple statues does not mean that, it doesn't change, the racist
Foundation.
Of America. But it's going to take people to stand up and to say that, that there is a problem, that there is a race problem in America. And that problem isn't black people. You see a lot of black people was saying that we want to, get along. We want to, what I mean? But what you have is a racist culture that refuses to change, is because there is also a white guilt. Because I was racist and because my ancestors were racist, I'm also benefiting from this system. And because I benefit from this system, I don't want to see it go. And so as we seen with the white nationalists, or I call them fascists, white nationalists, fascists, whatever you want to call them, they were marching in Charlottesville. And one of the things that they said was, "You cannot replace us." Now, what kind of mentality is that? Is it because of the rise of Hispanics? It's because of because we see that there was a black president, so now there's, it's insecurity, and white racism is a mental disorder, and white people have got to, what Remington said, white people have got to look inside themselves and see, well, why do I feel insecure? It's like James Baldwin said, this mentality of creating a nigger, what did that come from? Because I'm not the nigger, so why do I have to, as a white person, why do you have to say that this person is this and this person is that and this person is that? Now, what is hitting there inside of you that you feel that you have to create policies, and you have to feel like in order for my people to rise, I have to put down other people? So that's a problem that white America has to work within itself. It's a continuously denial of white racism. We can see that with President Trump. And look at what he's doing. He refused to say that those white nationalists were wrong for what they did. He said there were good people on both sides. There were bad people on both sides. So we can see this type of behavior. This is double speak, So they were wrong for what they did. And why couldn't he just call them out? But more than Trump, we have to look at the history of America. And why can't white America face up to their own history? Where is that guilt there? And I think that guilt lies because there is white privilege that white people don't want to give up. And Trump said, I can go and shoot somebody out in the street and they still will vote for me. And you know why he said he could shoot somebody and they would still vote for me? Because he played to these core values. I'm with white people. I'm going to stand up for white nationalism. I'm going to, and that's why these people voted for him, because there was a fear. And so, it's going to take white people to look inside of themselves and say, what is it in me that I had to create the nigger? I had to create these racial slurs. What is it within me that I felt inadequate, or I had to project my insecurities upon other people? And I believe that that's the question that white people are going to have to ask themselves.
And there's a minimizing of harm and denying harm is a very common tactic of abusers. You know, when you start getting into the patterns, the tactics that, you know, that men use to abuse women psychologically and physically, a lot of it involves.
And just to note that women can also perpetrate abuse on men, and regardless of gender.
Well,
but,
yeah, but it's usually men. Like it's a
usually,
patriarchal problem,
yeah.
kind of, you know, and I'm hesitant to, you know, to be like, oh well, you know, women also, because to me that hits my ear just the same as like when somebody says, oh well, black people can be racist too, and like there's a system of power that benefits men and harms women, and that system of power is an important component. Because if a woman abuses a man, she's going to be treated very differently by the system. And
there are court cases that can show you that where a woman who suffered systemic abuse for years and years eventually killed her husband in her sleep, and of course went to jail for murder, although he had done all these things for years and years. So there's definitely differential experiences of who gets the short end of the stick.
Precisely. But the thing is, there's this tendency to minimize the harm, to say, oh well, that's, you know, I don't see this what the harm is. And traditionally, you'll find that there are a lot of people who will benefit from systems and stay quiet, just as you said. And in my mind, they're essentially complicit. You know, like if we look at the thing with Harvey Weinstein, there's a whole bunch of people who knew about it and kept their mouths shut. In my mind, they're complicit. And I would say the same is true of white people who find ways to conveniently look the other way when these things happen.
So I also want to talk about Vincent Young, since he was another kind of a local case. And what I heard is his family received a call on February 14th in 2017 saying that he had hung himself in a jail cell. Unfortunately, there was some kind of conflicting evidence about actually what happened to him. Can you tell me about what happened to Vincent?
Well, I mean, as of now, nobody knows exactly what happened to Vincent Young. But one thing we do know, that he did not hang himself in a jail cell. What happened is that Vincent Young had problems within the law, and it got to a point where the officers were starting to badger him. And the last time he went to jail, before they so-called said he hung himself, they said that they would kill him inside of the prisons, inside of the jail cell. And so the next time he came, he was actually, you know, murdered, and his family received that call. So the coroner's office, I'm not going to, you know, because I would like the family to speak on a lot of things. But what happened is there's issues with the coroner's office and their story, and them not finding evidence that the family actually found that shows that Vincent Young did not hang himself in a jail cell. And the family said, well, how could he hang himself in a jail cell with the jail, with the beds that they give you in jail? They said that the beds that they give you in jail, it wasn't even sufficient enough to hold his weight and his height. So we're looking at a man that's over 200 pounds that would hang himself from a bed in the jails. So they're saying that does not seem right to them, that he was abused in prison before, sexually abused by guards in prison before, and they threatened his life. Vincent Young's fathers said that there were times where Vincent would be just out at the store. He would be with his family, and the officers would come and threaten him and threaten to arrest him. And, you know, so there has been a a whole pattern of abuse of Vincent Young. And so when they said he hung himself, he was going to get out the next day from jail. So they said, why would someone who was going to get out the next day hang himself? And also, he wasn't the type that would go to jail and just fold. So he's used to having these run-ins with the police targeting him, abusing him, whatever. So he would not be the type that would go in and hang himself. So that's been the story. What the family wants is they just want justice for Vincent Young, and they want to know exactly what happened with Vincent Young when he was in that jail cell. And they want the truth to come out. So, they've heard there's stories where they've talked to the coroner's office, and the coroner's office has actually manipulated evidence in that the Texas Rangers said that they would do an investigation on what happened with Vincent Young, and they never completed an investigation. So the family is just still fighting for justice, and there has been no answers for that family.
There also seems to be a kind of maybe a catch-22 in police departments investigating themselves for misconduct.
Absolutely.
That's
Absolutely.
kind of having to catch yourself with your hand in the cookie jar. Doesn't that kind of have a set of its own perverse incentives?
Well, it's funny because going back to this whole Hollywood portrayal of, there's this assumption that people who work in internal affairs are somehow in this adversarial role, where they come in and they're these mean, tough outsiders who are going to hold everybody accountable and stuff like that. It couldn't be further from the truth. Typically in police departments, what happens is somebody who's been there for a while will do a turn in internal affairs, at which point they're essentially there to hold all of their friends accountable. And then after they do a year or two, they're going to rotate out and somebody else is going to do it, at which point, they understand that that some of the people that they may have held accountable might be in the position to hold them accountable. So there's this large culture of holding the line in police departments. And it can get really quite vindictive. For instance, there have been common problems where if a police officer does speak out, like for instance, the officer who eventually came clean about what happened to Joe Campos Torres 40 years ago, he was very quickly let go, and it was made very difficult for him to continue working there. But that's not something that was just happening 40 years ago. It's a common thing in police departments. If somebody acts in a way that causes an officer to be held accountable, they will be blackballed in a way that can involve, like, if they call for help, none of the other officers will show up. And there's a general understanding of that, that if you hold your fellow officers accountable, you're going to be punished, and they will make it darn close to impossible to actually continue working there and surviving there. So it creates this culture where no one holds anybody accountable, and there's this unchecked power that allows them to continue brutalizing people. And this has been, shown time and time again. And unfortunately, there just doesn't seem to be any political will to create the types of institutional changes that would be necessary for the police to be less violently racist.
Do you think these kind of incidents where civilians are shot by the police will just continue to happen as long as it can? Like, until there is some change that like, as long as you can get away with doing it, why stop?
I am quite pessimistic, unfortunately. I have difficulty believing that that anything is going to change until people start holding law enforcement accountable. And as it stands, we've still got a very pervasive culture of treating law enforcement with a great deal of deference, even when they are caught on video lynching someone.
Another thing too is I like what Remington pointed out with accountability. There has been zero accountability within really on a local government, national government. So this what has happened in Harris County, what's happening in Houston, it just mimics the national problem that we have. With Kim Og saying that she criticized Devon Anderson for not holding crooked cops accountable, and then she comes in and she does the same thing. With Alva Brazil, there was a no bill after he was shot 16 times, with his hands in the air screaming, "Don't shoot." Not only that, inside of the jail with Terry Goodwin, who was left in the jail with feces, and the deputies falsified documents. There was an original indictment, and then that indictment was dropped. We can see with Charneza Corsley, who was sexually assaulted by officers. There was an original indictment under Devon Anderson, and then Kim Og goes and reverses that indictment. And now with Vincent Young, we're kind of up in the air about that. So as we can see that even when these politicians say that, well, we're more just than this other politician because they're Republican and I'm a Democrat, then I'm going to be more just. There's still no change. And that's a lot of because of the district attorney's office. There's a lot because of the mayor. And the mayor who lied on Alva Brazil and said he pointed a gun. And that's a narrative a lot of police officers has been using lately, is that with Alva Brazil, he pointed a gun at the police officers. Well, on the video, we don't see where Alva Brazil pointed a gun at, and they have not provided evidence for that. It's the same thing with Charneza Corsley. They said we reversed that indictment because there was so-called new evidence. Where is that new evidence? So as we can see that we have a system where there is false promises, and we vote for these people and we put them in office and we believe and have hope, and these people still don't do anything to change this system of police brutality. So it's going to not only start with the district attorney's office, it's going to start with the mayor as well, and there has to be a very serious discussion about, policing in America, and I proposed a question. I was on a panel at Texas Southern University, and well, they proposed a question of, the education of police officers, and I told them that police officers should gain the history of white supremacy in the police department. As Remington pointed out earlier, that police started from slave patrols. So I think that we're expecting something from a system that in itself is incapable of changing, And so when we talk about accountability, I think a large part of our problem is that we look at Democrats and we hope for change. Now, Republicans, they're, they overt, whatever, their racism is out in the open. When you look at Democrats, it's this racism that, only certain people like black and brown people see, where it's not in the open. So we have to realize that Democrats, Republicans, that type of system has not been our friend and will never be our friend. And if we're looking for justice towards that system, then it's not going to work. But I believe that people should be aware. I believe that's the first step, is to people to be aware of what Kim Og is doing. I mean, right now, Kim Og has, someone that works for Kim Og has plans of going to Texas Southern University and saying there has been no corruption in the prosecution process. I mean, come on, And so when these people that are Democrats, they do the same thing to us. They're not held accountable because they're so-called for the Progressive Democratic Party when they're doing the same thing the Republican Party did, or even worse. The only thing that's changing is their language. They're promising things that never happen.
It seems so tone deaf for them to go to TSU, because there's There seems to have been this long-running trend with Houston Police Department. I think it's once a year. They have a big pomp and circumstance celebration at TSU where they come out and they bring their big trucks and their helicopters and all of their paramilitary equipment and show it off with their shoot, don't shoot simulator. And they'll have a panel, I've gone a couple of times, of like 20 high-ranking police officials. And like maybe the first 2 or 3 rows might have civilians and a couple of professors and maybe a couple of interested activists who are there to, like, you know, try and speak truth to power as though power doesn't know what it's already doing. And then the rest of the auditorium is filled with police officers. And they treat it as this outreach where they come out and they say, oh, look at all of the great stuff we're doing in the community. And, you know, and it adds insult to injury that they're doing it in the heart of the community that they victimize the most. But, you know, I'm glad you mentioned Kim Og because, frankly, I guess to me, Kim Og was not a surprise, and here's why. When she was running, one of the things that she advertised was that they were going to not bust people for weed, or at least it was creatively worded so that it would sound like that. Yeah. And what it actually was is this thing called diversion. Now, this is a really interesting thing within the criminal justice system. It's essentially if you pay a fine to the district attorney's office, we're not going to call it a bribe, but what they'll do is they just won't file the charges, okay? That's how diversion works, and you can get all records removed. It's essentially a way of making it so that people with money can pay a thing that we won't call a bribe, ever, because they don't like you calling it that, to have their record cleaned. And so, you know, this idea is it gets advertised as we're not going to prosecute, we're going to let people get them dismissed more easily. What it actually is a way to make it so that there's a pay extra line where, you know, people with a fair amount of wealth and or white privilege can, you know, come in and say, oh, okay, I'm going to pay a thing that we're still not going to call a bribe ever, ever, ever to have our charge dismissed. And everybody else who's poor still has to deal with the entire system. And so, but Kim Og is not going to tell you that part. She just is trying to figure out something that's going to have some level of political expediency and make it look like she's doing the right thing while still being able to extract wealth and disproportionately punish poor black and brown people. But, you know, Kim Og's history with this is pretty consistent. Because it's worth noting that she was the special prosecutor in the South Lawn gang injunction, which was a vast overreach of civil court power, essentially identifying anybody who made the mistake of being seen out in public while black as gang members, thereby initiating, there was an injunction to say that gang members couldn't be in the neighborhood. So it was causing people who may have been sitting on their own front porch to be exiled from the community. Now, it was eventually gotten rid of. But, you know, folks like Kim Og just say, oh, well, we're doing our job, we're following the law. But, you know, this is not just something where she was just going through the process. It was her idea to use this innovative process to assist with gentrification.
It seems like you're kind of talking about where there's really two different criminal justice systems. One for minorities and people of color, and I also was putting that you know, people who are religious minorities or people with disabilities, because they also are in gender and sexuality. They also face a different reality than the male hetero white normative standard. So there seem to be two parallel systems. One where you can maybe pay a little extra money if you have it and kind of get through the system easier, and the other one where it's a meat grinder.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And it's not even just the criminal system. I mean, like, you know, if you look at the recent lawsuits that are popping up over the Addicks and Barker reservoirs overflowing the rich neighborhoods along Buffalo Bayou, there are multiple large law firms clamoring to pick up clients in a class action lawsuit so that they can sue the government. 10 years ago, when somebody blew a levee in New Orleans, none of that happened. Not a bit. And you know why? It was a different kind of a neighborhood. I'm going to let you guess which kind.
Just as we're kind of wrapping up here. So no group of people, I believe, is a monolith, or can be said all these people are bad. There must be cops out there that are trying to do the right thing, that have gone into this profession because they truly do want to protect and serve the public. And I think there are people who actually really feel that and are on the force now who really want to do that. How do we support these people, facilitate them? How do we promote these people and weed out the cops that are in these ranks that are clearly more violent?
I don't know that we have any. I don't know that we have any control over that system. Number one. Number two, those folks tend to get forced out, or they learn to assimilate the culture or look the other way. So I guess to me it's baked into the system. Like there's not any way for us to exert power over a bunch of people, who are paid by the government and loyal to the wills of racist laws. And, it's worth noting that it's not just a matter of a couple of bad apples. Although the saying does go, a bad apple can spoil the whole bunch, and I would argue that the whole bunch is beyond spoiled. But even with well-intentioned police, the laws are still racist. The laws are still sexist. The courts are still racist and sexist. The judges are still racist and sexist. So, like, the way that this system survives is that even if you remove one block, the rest of the structure is still there. So there's not any way that we can just say, oh, well, there are just going to be good cops. Because those good cops are still going to be taking human beings who are targeted by a racist system and locking them in cages.
Indeed. So would maybe education be really what we need to turn to? Maybe the next generation, letting the next generation know the actual history of policing, where policing started, why the southern states seceded, which was because of slavery, not because of states' rights. They say that in their articles of secession. So maybe would education be a counterbalance to slowly changing this culture?
Well, education requires that people be unaware of a problem. And I would argue that people who are on the receiving end of all of this, Nikki doesn't need an education. Nikki knows exactly what's going on. People who are on the receiving end of this know exactly what's going on. Now, white folks like us might be somewhat oblivious. I would argue that there's a deliberate nature to that. That to fail to see the racial injustices in this country is to be deliberately turning a blind eye. But even with the instance of trying to educate, you can't educate someone who doesn't want to learn.
Yeah, and I completely agree with that. Education will start. It has to start from birth. White people have got to be educated in this country about the history and about the role that they've played in oppressing indigenous people, oppressing African people. And we can see with history books, a lot of that has been written out of history. And also with the policing system, there needs to be education. But as Remington said, that's even a question as well that comes to. Even with that education, will white America change? So that's I feel like is the larger question. Will there still be change with the education of white America? And I would say this too. There needs to be a complete history here. I think that's one of the solutions to our problem, but I don't think we'll ever get it in this type of system. Because, like I said before, white America doesn't want to tap into their history, because then they know that there's something that has to be done about it, and there's a change that I don't think white America is ready for. And so denial works, because if I can deny it, then I can continue in this blind system, which originally it's going to hurt us all, But as far as history, Mexican history, you know, Black history, all of that is history. And it's so sad because we only hear pieces and parts of history. You know, there's a false narrative about Malcolm X when we're brought up that Malcolm X was this mean, bad guy, and Martin Luther King was the way, but Malcolm X, he taught hatred. Malcolm X never taught hatred. You know, so it's just time for everybody to realize we have got to tell the truth. That is the beginning of it. Marcus Garvey felt like there was a solution. Malcolm X felt like there was a solution. You know, for Black and white people to sit down and to say how they honestly feel about one another. So it's time to be honest about history. It's time to be honest about white supremacy. It's time to be honest about how this system operates, because if we're not honest, we won't get anywhere. So that's, to me, the first step of everything is education. But then from that honesty, will that produce change? And I think that's another question that has to be answered as well.
Yeah, and to kind of piggyback on what you're saying about like what people are learning in history class, you know, it's important to note that in the standard public education, you know, what passes for history is, oh, let's go learn what the primary cash crop is of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, you know, or, you know, this mythology about George Washington and his cherry tree, or Betsy Ross and the mythical flag, you know, all of which are, well, the flag, I don't know about the cash crops. I kind of got the impression that, you know, they dealt heavily in slavery, but they don't really ever seem to discuss that. And those crimes get glossed over for a reason. And it's that, you know, if you look into the history of education, it's not like the government woke up one day and said, wow, we really want some empowered, literate people who, you know, understand how to think for themselves. Like, that's not something that anyone in power wants. So instead, there's a very selective use of history curricula in order to propagandize and indoctrinate and sow the seeds of nationalistic fervor and loyalty to authority. So, you know, this is why you've got history textbooks that, you know, I saw one yesterday that talked about how Native Americans agreed to relocate to make room for settlers. You know, and conveniently forgets about smallpox-covered blankets and, you know, other tactics that were used to wage genocide against Native American people. So, like, and that glossing over is meant to make people have this image of America as a beacon on a hill, when in fact, you know, I think Dr. King put it best when he said, you know, that the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today is my own government. That was 50 years ago. Our military is much larger. We've killed a lot more people since then. So it's only gotten worse. But that's, and you know, it's worth noting that the government whitewashed Dr. King and never quotes anything past 1964. If you ask most white people, the only Dr. King that they can quote is "I Have a Dream," and usually they talk about "I Have a Dream" as a way of shutting down dialogue about racial inequities.
Indeed. So, what are some of the ways people in their local communities can kind of raise awareness about police brutality? We've seen it on the larger stage of the NFL with taking a knee, or even at local football games in the Houston area, student players taking a knee. Is that you think a good tactic, or is it just causing controversy?
It's a very good tactic, I believe, because people feel like, well, you know, football is when I can just sit down and relax and not have to worry about anything, but it brings a problem to white America, and then it starts other conversations. I believe every form of activism is very important, and I wouldn't put down any form of activism that's raising awareness to what's going on, which is why I protest, although I feel like there has to be something larger that needs to happen to eventually stop what's going on. But at least if the question is raised and people are made to feel uncomfortable, that's what we need to do.
And I agree with you. I respect anybody who's willing to put effort into working to end injustices.
Anyway, I would like to thank you both for being here and for sharing your views on such an important topic, really to all of us in society. Thank Thank you so much. This has been Green Watch.
With power, here they come, international loan sharks, backed by the guns of